Mark and I have always had the habit of looking for quiet places to escape the routine. We live in Denver, and last fall we decided to rent a cabin in the middle of the Colorado mountains to spend the weekend. It was a very isolated place, overlooking the valley and surrounded by tall trees. The owner warned that the cell phone signal was almost non-existent, but the cabin had landline and heating, so it seemed perfect. The road there was narrow, full of curves, and on the day we arrived it started to rain nonstop. It wasn't a light rain, it was one of those that seemed to wash the whole world, and the noise of the drops on the metal roof made the interior seem even quieter. The first night was quiet. We made dinner, watched a movie on the laptop, and went to bed early, listening to the constant sound of rain and wind passing through the trees. On the second night, however, everything started to get weird. Around midnight, I was reading in bed while Mark finished washing the dishes. That's when we heard 3 loud knocks on the door. The sound was so loud that I felt my heart stop for a second. The cabin was small, so you could clearly hear that it was someone knocking, and not the wind or a branch. Mark looked at me a little confused, and I could only say, "No one knows we're here." He went to the door, and I stood in the hallway trying to hear something. On the other side, a male voice said, "Sorry, I got lost on the trail. Can I use the phone just for a minute?" The way he spoke didn't seem desperate. It seemed rehearsed, too calm for someone who was really lost on a rainy and cold night. Mark replied that he could not enter, but that he could call the police if the man wanted. The guy was silent for a few seconds, then insisted, "Just a minute, young man, it's fast." The tone changed a little, it got lower, almost impatient. Mark repeated that he wasn't going to open, and asked him to say the number, or the name of someone we could call. The man didn't answer. He was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then I heard the sound of footsteps slowly moving away. We stood there, listening to the noise of the rain, and trying to understand if he had really left. Mark leaned his face against the glass of the living room window to see if he could see something, but the reflection of the light and the darkness outside made it impossible to see anything. When he turned off the light to try to look better, I swear I saw a silhouette standing on the other side of the deck, very close to the kitchen window. It was a human form, still without moving. Mark turned on the light again, and the figure disappeared. He thought it was my impression, but I was sure of what I saw. The rain was beating so hard that the noise muffled any other sound, but for some reason I began to feel that there were steps circling the cabin. Heavy, slow steps, accompanied by an occasional snap of wet wood. Mark went to the kitchen, and tried to look through the side curtain. At that moment, a metallic sound came from the back door, as if someone had moved the handle. We ran to the room and locked the door, even though we knew it wasn't much use, because the walls were thin. We stayed in the dark, trying to hear any sign. The wind made the trees creak, but between the intervals I swear I heard the sound of footsteps, and something like breathing near the windows. Mark took the cell phone, but there was no signal. The only thing we could do was wait for dawn. I couldn't sleep all night. Around 3 in the morning, the noise stopped completely. No step, no stronger wind. Only the sound of the rain gradually decreasing. When it finally dawned, the floor of the deck was full of boot marks. They were not ours. They had wet footprints that circled the entire cabin, some so close to the windows that you could see the exact shape of the soles. In the corner, at the back door, there were fresh scratches on the lock, as if someone had tried to force the entrance. Mark tried to follow the footprints, but they went to the dirt road and stopped. There were no back footprints, no tire marks, nothing. We called the local police, and 2 officers went there. They looked at everything, took pictures, and said it was probably someone asking for shelter, maybe a resident of the region who got lost. But one of them, the oldest, commented in a low tone, "This happens from time to time here. They always say it was just a trail, but they never find anyone." We packed our bags and returned to the city on the same day. We didn't talk much on the way, because anything I tried to say seemed small near the fear I felt. Sometimes I wonder if that man really wanted help, or if he was waiting for some opportunity to get in. To this day I find myself wondering what would have happened if Mark had opened the door at that time. There are nights when I wake up with the sound of the rain and stay still, thinking that I will hear those same knocks on the door again. The cabin is still listed for rent. I saw it the other day out of curiosity, but there are no recent comments since that month. And every time I think about it, I remember the footprints that ended on the road, with no return, as if that person had simply disappeared with the dawn. Story 2. I worked as a temporary janitor in a small set of lakeside cabins in Maine last fall. The place was very isolated, and out of season practically no one showed up there. The function was simple: take care of maintenance, ensure that the cabins were in order, and make night rounds to avoid invasions or vandalism. Most tourists only came in the summer, so at that time the place was quiet in an almost uncomfortable way. During the day, the wind passed between the trees, and the sound of falling leaves was the only thing that could be heard. At night, the lake looked like a huge black spot, completely motionless. I quickly got used to the loneliness, but some nights the silence was too strange, as if there was something hidden in it. One of those nights, it was very windy, and the cold was cutting. I went out for my round with the flashlight and the clipboard, writing down everything I needed to review later. It was around 11:30 when I passed by the main pier and saw a dim light moving over the water, about 50 meters ahead. It looked like a flashing flashlight, as if someone were in a kayak or small boat. But there was no authorization to use boats at night. The lake was fenced, and only I had the keys to the side gates. I stood still watching for a few good minutes, trying to understand what it was. The light moved slowly, swaying from one side to the other, sometimes disappearing for a few seconds, and then reappearing later. I thought it could be a reflection of some house on the opposite bank, but there was nothing there, only dense forest. I took the radio and called the security guard, but the signal was weak and no one answered. That's when I noticed something strange. The light stopped moving and was fixed, pointed directly in the direction where I was. A chill went up the back of my neck. I felt an immediate desire to get out of there, but I stood still trying to reason. The wind made the pier creak, and I could hear, very low, the sound of something crashing against the wood, as if someone was touching the boat. The light suddenly went out. I stared into the dark for a few seconds and decided to go back to the main trail. When I started walking, I heard wet steps behind me, slow, heavy. When I turned the flashlight, there was no one, but the sound continued, getting closer and closer. I ran to the balcony of the main cabin, where I was staying, and that's when I realized something that made me stop on the spot. There were wet footprints going up from the pier to the balcony of the neighboring cabin, one of those that had been officially closed since September. The marks were large and well defined, as if someone had come out of the water barefoot minutes before. I followed the footprints to the cabin door. She was leaning, not locked, and the wind made the hinge creak. When I pushed the door, the smell of humidity took the air. Inside, the bed was marked by a dark spot, as if someone had lay there completely soaked. The blanket was still damp. On the nightstand, a glass turned, with water dripping on the floor. Everything seemed too recent, as if it had happened while I was watching the light in the lake. I stood there, completely frozen, trying to find a logical explanation. I saw the room, the bathroom, the kitchen, nothing. No sign of anyone, no wet clothes, nothing that justified those footprints. The back window was closed from the inside. I closed everything, locked the door, and went back to my cabin, writing down the incident on the clipboard, as the protocol dictated, even without knowing what to put exactly. When it dawned, I went straight to the office and checked the cabin records. The number of the cabin where I found the footprints was 7. I looked for her usage history, and the last guest had stayed the previous year in October. The exit record was unsigned, only with a note in red: missing guest, search closed in 48 hours. There were no details, just a cold and brief note, as if they wanted to hide what happened. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to work normally, but the thought of light and footprints didn't leave my head. Around 4 in the next morning, I woke up with the sound of the wind beating the windows. I got up to check, and when I looked at the lake, I saw the same light again. But this time she didn't move. It stood still, exactly at the same point where I had seen it before. I kept watching, trying to understand if it was a reflection of something, but no, it was a flashlight light, firm, clear, directed at me. He didn't blink, he didn't move away. It was as if someone was holding and staring at me from there. I stayed there for about 5 minutes, unable to look away, until the wind blew hard and the light simply went out. The next day, I commented on what happened to the old janitor, who lived nearby. He just looked at me for a while and said that lake had already had old stories of people who disappear or listen to things when the season ends. He said that the locals avoid passing by after sunset. He didn't seem to be joking. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and still slept badly. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see that light stopped on the water, as if it were watching me in silence. And sometimes I wonder if that guest who disappeared last year really left the lake, or if he's still there, drawing the attention of those who stay alone too long looking at the dark. Story 3. When I, Justin, and Omar rented that cabin in Tennessee, the idea was simple. A weekend away from the city, light trails, and a little peace. The place seemed isolated, but beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and a gravel road that led to the dirt parking lot. On the first day, we arrived at dusk, and already on the way between the car and the cabin, Justin noticed something strange. There was a small camera attached to a tree, pointed not at the forest, but at the very path we used. I imagined it was some kind of security of the place, but a few meters ahead, he found another one, also facing the same side, as if someone wanted to film who arrived. Inside the cabin, everything seemed in order. Smell of wood, rustic furniture, an old fireplace. Omar opened a beer and made a joke about us being observed by the government, but even jokingly, he looked out the window 2 or 3 times while it got dark. Outside, the silence was different from what I was used to. There was no constant sound of crickets, only the wind passing through the trees and the occasional snapping of branches. When night fell for good, Justin decided to go out to take a look at the cameras. He came back a few minutes later, saying that one of them had a small LED lit, as if she was recording. Around 10:30, I was already lying down reading, and I heard a light sound coming from the balcony, something like a quick touch on the metallic handrail twice. Justin thought it was the wind swinging something, but Omar, who was in the room, swore to have seen a shadow move between the nearby trees. We went out with flashlights, checked the surroundings, and found nothing but old trail footprints. Even so, we locked everything and left the kitchen light on. The feeling of being watched didn't let me sleep. At 3:07 a.m., I remember this time because I looked at my cell phone. We heard the noise of a muffled engine. Justin went to the window and called me in a low voice. A truck was stopped on the gravel road, with no headlights on. We were watching, trying to understand what was happening. The person got out of the vehicle, went to one of the trees where the camera was, and used something that reflected the light. It looked like a small flashlight. She moved for a few seconds and then walked back, but before getting into the car, she raised the flashlight and pointed directly to the window where we were. We were completely motionless, not knowing if he could see us inside. The light stayed there fixed for about 5 seconds, and then went out. The sound of the engine was slowly moving away until it disappeared. I was still shaking when Justin said it didn't make sense. No one would have reason to monitor a private trail at this time. We slept little, each one with an ear attentive to any sound. When it dawned, we went out to see it up close. The camera that the man had moved was still there, but the SD card had been removed. Instead, there were recent tire marks on the wetland. The other camera, the one closest to the cabin, had been torn off. We found the metal support bent and thrown near the tool depot. It was as if someone had come back during the night and finished the service. Omar suggested we leave immediately, but Justin insisted on looking for the owner of the rental to understand what was happening. He sent a message to the ad number and got no response. We decided not to wait for explanations. We packed our things quickly and loaded the car. When we started, I noticed something that made my stomach cold. The road that led back to the highway passed exactly in front of the point where the truck had stopped. On the floor, in addition to the tire marks, there was a small trail of ashes, perhaps of cigarettes and boot prints. It was clear that the guy had stood there for longer than we imagined, probably watching the cabin. None of us commented anything until we were about 10 kilometers away. Arriving in the city center, we went straight to a small local police station. The policeman listened to our report calmly and asked few questions, but when we mentioned the cameras, he let out a sigh and said that they had already received other similar complaints in the region. Supposedly, someone installed equipment on the nearby trails to monitor visitors, and to this day they didn't know who did it. Some hikers reported feeling that they were being followed or that their vehicles had been moved at night. No concrete case, no arrest. In the following days, I tried to forget what happened, but the image of that flashlight turning to us haunts me. It was like a calculated, almost provocative gesture, a way of saying, "I know where you are." 2 weeks later, the owner of the rental responded to Justin with a short message, apologizing and saying that the cameras did not belong to him. When Justin asked for more details, the number was out of service. Today, whenever I think about going back to some remote place, I remember that road and the metallic sound on the balcony. Someone at some point was watching us closely, not by chance nor out of curiosity. That kind of surveillance has a purpose. And the worst thing is to know that, in isolated places like that, if someone wants to know when you sleep, there's nothing to stop them. Story 4. I've never been the type to get scared easily. I've always liked isolated places, the sound of the wind in the trees, the silence that you don't find in any city. So, when I rented a small cabin in Vermont to spend a weekend alone writing, I didn't see any problem. The description said that it was surrounded by forest, with no neighbors nearby, which for me was ideal. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sky was cloudy, dry leaves covering the dirt road. The house was simple, made of dark wood, with a balcony overlooking the forest. Everything seemed quiet until the moment I looked through the living room window and noticed something. A car stopped between the trees, half hidden, about 50 meters ahead. At first, I thought it was someone lost, maybe a hunter or some resident in the area. I couldn't see the model very well, but it was dark, maybe an old sedan. I waited a while, but no one showed up. When it got dark, I on the fireplace and tried to ignore it. I spent the night reviewing my drafts, and at one point, I even forgot about the car. But the next morning, when I opened the curtains, he was still there. And it seemed different, a little more to the right, as if I had changed position. At that moment, something in me froze. I knew I could be imagining, but the inclination of the car on the slope was not the same as the night before. I took my cell phone and walked to the balcony, trying to see if there was anyone inside. The windows were dark, without reflection. I thought about calling someone, but the cell phone signal there was almost non-existent. As a precaution, I wrote down the plate number on a notepad and went back inside. I closed the curtains and tried to distract myself, but with each slap coming from the forest, I looked at the glass. The worst was silence, that kind of heavy silence, where any sound seems louder than it should. Even the noise of my breathing seemed strange. When it got dark again, the tension only increased. I turned on a few lights and left the fireplace lit, trying to keep the house as discreet as possible. Around 9, I was preparing a tea when I heard the noise, a car door slamming, far away, but audible. The sound came exactly from the direction of the forest. I stood still, motionless, holding the hot mug in my hands. Then came steps, slow, dragging dry leaves. 1, 2, 3, and then silence. I ran to the room, turned off all the lights and looked out the window, but I only saw the darkness between the trees. I thought about calling the police, but the signal was still weak. I managed to send a short message to the emergency center number. "There's someone hanging around my cabin." I didn't get an answer. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to hear anything but my heartbeat. At a certain moment, I heard something clearer, a heavy snap, as if someone had stepped on branches very close to the balcony. I was completely quiet. The sound was repeated twice. And then out of nowhere it stopped. I spent the whole night awake, listening to the wind and the sound of the rain starting to fall. When the first light of the morning appeared, I looked out the window again. The car was no longer there. The space between the trees was empty, except for an overturned patch of earth, where before the tires had pressed the ground. The relief didn't last long, because I noticed something on the ground near the entrance of the trail. Footsteps going towards the cabin, but none coming back. As if the person had come, and then disappeared in the middle of the night. As soon as the cell phone signal returned, I called the local police. The attendant asked me not to leave until a vehicle arrived, which took almost an hour. When they finally arrived, they searched the area and wrote down my report. It was one of the policemen who found something that made me freeze again. An open coffee can, thrown behind a tree, with several cigarette butts inside. Some still smelled of fresh tobacco, as if they had been extinguished a few hours before. One of the officers commented that it indicated that someone had stood there, sitting, watching. The angle of the tree gave a direct view to the living room window and the balcony where I had been the night before. He said that, by the state of the earth, it seemed that the car had left around dawn, maybe minutes before I looked. He asked me if I had seen the driver. I shook my head. I hadn't seen anyone, and honestly, I'd rather it continue like this. I packed my bags in silence while they finished the inspection. One of them advised me not to stay there alone anymore, at least until they understood what happened. Before leaving, I looked at the woods once more. That empty space between the trees seemed normal, but I knew someone had been there, and who probably watched me for hours, in silence, maybe laughing at the fact that I can't do anything about it. I went back to the city and stayed in a hotel. The following days were a blur, calls with the police, emails with the owner of the rental, all without conclusive answers. They said the car was never identified. No suspicious vehicle registration in that region. But what bothers me to this day is the certainty that that car was not there by chance. He was placed on that point on purpose, with a direct view of the window where I spent most of the time. I haven't been back to isolated places since then. It's strange how something so simple, a car parked in the middle of the thus, can completely change the way you feel about loneliness. Before, isolation calmed me down. Now, he makes me think about how many times someone may be watching you, hidden in the darkness, while you believe you're alone. Story 5. When my wife, Lindsay, and I booked that cottage in the countryside of Oregon, all we wanted was a weekend away from everything. It was early October, the cold began to tighten, and the owner of the property assured that we would be the only guests in that stretch. The road to the cottage was narrow and covered with leaves, and when we arrived, I noticed that there was another cabin a little further down the hill, old, with the windows covered by boards and the roof almost collapsing. He commented in passing that that unit was out of use, and that no one had been there for a long time. On the first night, the silence was almost absolute. Only the sound of the wind passing between the trees and the light creak of the balcony. I remember that, around 11 o'clock, Lindsay and I were watching something on the laptop when we heard a metallic sound coming from the direction of that abandoned cabin. It was as if someone dragged a pipe on the floor, rhythmically. For a while I thought it was the wind, but the sound came at regular intervals, as if someone did it on purpose. I went to the window and stood there, trying to understand what I was hearing. The distance was not great, maybe 100 meters, and even with the darkness, I could distinguish the shape of the other hut among the trees. The sound continued for a few seconds, and then suddenly stopped. I went back to the couch trying not to worry Lindsay, but I realized that she had also heard. She asked if it was an animal. I didn't know what to answer. About half an hour later, as the wind increased, a light came on there in the other cabin. It wasn't constant, it blinked, turned off, turned on again. A flashlight, maybe. And she seemed to move inside the place. I stared, hoping to see a silhouette or something like that, but I could only see the intermittent reflection of the light in the cracks of the windows. It was enough to freeze my stomach. Lindsay got very scared and asked me to call the owner of the cottage. I tried, but the cell phone had no signal. I thought about using the cabin's Wi-Fi to send a message, but it fell all the time with the strong wind. So we decided to just lock all the doors and try to sleep. None of us could close our eyes properly that night. Every snap of the wood seemed to come from outside. Around 3 in the morning, the noise came back. It was no longer metallic, it was something lighter, like slow steps on the floor covered with leaves. They seemed to come from outside, near the forest that separated the two cabins. I went to the kitchen window, and I swear, for a moment I saw a glow moving between the trees, the same light that flashed before. At this point, I could only think of someone wandering around the cottages. We stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally came out, I went out to see the other cabin up close, even with the cutting cold. The earth was still damp, but there was no recent mark of footprints, only scattered leaves and broken branches. Getting close, I realized that the door was locked with a thick chain, and the padlock looked old. The curious thing is that there was dust accumulated on the doorknob, as if no one had touched it for a long time. I looked through the cracks of the boards covering the window and saw only an empty interior, an old mattress, a broken chair, and nothing else. No sign of flashlight, movement, or someone having been there recently. Even so, that feeling of being watched didn't go away. When we returned to our cabin, I told everything to the owner of the property, who arrived at the end of the morning to check the heater. He listened in silence and, without showing surprise, just said that sometimes the wind makes strange noises in that direction. But when I mentioned the flashing light, he hesitated. That's when he admitted that that cabin had been locked for more than a year. He said that no one had been staying there since a storm knocked down part of the ceiling, and that he had not yet obtained authorization to reform. According to him, they had already complained before about lights turning on by themselves at that point. I tried to laugh at that, as if it were a coincidence, but his tone was too serious. Lindsay, who was next to me, just shook her head, as if she had already accepted that we weren't going to sleep well next night. We decided to leave a day earlier than expected. On the way back, I looked through the rearview mirror and saw the silhouette of the abandoned cabin being behind, half hidden among the pine trees. For a second, I had the impression of seeing something shining in the window, a short blink, like the reflection of a flashlight. I never went back to that place. Sometimes, when the wind blows hard at night and the sound hits against the roof of my house, I remember the metallic noise coming from that direction. I still don't know if someone was there or if it was just the wind, but a part of me swears that there was someone in that cabin, and who knew we were watching. Story 6. I rented that cabin in northern Minnesota because I wanted a weekend alone, photographing the colors of autumn. I always liked this feeling of isolation, the sound of the wind passing through the trees and the distant sound of branches breaking on the wet ground. The cabin was simple, but cozy, a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a wooden bed that creaked every time I moved. It was the perfect kind of place to disconnect from the world, or at least I thought so at first. On the first morning, I left very early to photograph the trees around the lake. The air was cold enough to make the breath come out in clouds, and the leaves had that strong orange tone that only exists at this time of year. I walked for hours and came back in the late afternoon, with the good feeling of tiredness. But when I arrived at the cabin, I noticed that the kitchen door was unlocked. I was absolutely sure that I had locked it before leaving. It was a habit of mine, even more so being alone. At the time, I tried to convince myself that maybe I had forgotten, but the doubt kept hammering. I entered slowly, observing everything. Nothing seemed out of place. The cameras were where I left them, the backpack too. The window was closed. Only one thing caught my attention: a coffee mug on the sink, with a thread of steam still coming out. I hadn't made coffee that day. And even if I had been out for hours, the steam shouldn't be there. That detail made me restless. I looked again at the kitchen, at the table, and at the floor. No clear sign of invasion, nothing broken, no open window. But the fact that the door was unlocked and the mug was there didn't make sense. I even looked under the bed, from the sofa. I even opened the closet, feeling kind of silly. But fear began to give way to a sense of alertness. In the late afternoon, the light began to disappear, and I lit the lamps in the living room and kitchen. The silence was so heavy that you could hear the squeak of the wood on the walls. I tried to ignore it and do what I came to do: download the photos on the notebook, review the material of the day. But around 9 o'clock at night, while I was having tea, I noticed something on the floor: marks of wet boots. They were big marks, going from the kitchen door to the living room carpet. I didn't wear boots that day, only sneakers. My stomach froze on the spot. I was following the footprints with my heart racing. They went to the carpet, then disappeared, as if the person had stopped there. There was nothing else. They didn't even come back to the door. It was as if someone had entered and stayed inside the cabin. I ran to the phone to call the owner of the place, but the device only gave a hiss. I took the phone, no signal. I tried to open the messaging app and nothing loaded. It was as if everything had stopped working at the same time. I looked at the window and the wind made the trees bend. I thought about getting out of there and driving to the nearest city, but the dirt road was completely dark and the fine rain was starting to fall. I locked all the doors and windows and went to the room. I took a flashlight and left the camera in video mode, facing the door. I was trying to be rational, but I felt a constant discomfort, as if someone was still there, standing in some corner watching. I lay down, but I couldn't sleep. With each snap of the wood, my whole body locked. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a noise in the hallway. It was a slight sound, like something scraping on the floor. I froze. I held my breath and waited. The sound was repeated, a little closer. I took the flashlight and pointed at the door. Silence. Then a soft, almost imperceptible touch from the outside of the room. My heart beat so hard that it seemed to echo in my head. I was like this for a while that I don't know how to measure, until the sound stopped. When I finally got the courage to look, the house looked exactly the same. Everything quiet, everything stopped. I decided to try to sleep again, even if the fear wouldn't let me. When the sun finally appeared, I woke up still dizzy, as if I hadn't really slept. I went straight to the kitchen to try to rationalize everything, and that's when I realized. The mug. She was no longer in the sink. It was on the nightstand, next to my bed, exactly where I would have seen her if I turned on the light during the night. The steam was already gone, but the coffee inside was still warm. I stood looking at that for a long time, not knowing what to think. I took the things and left there in less than 10 minutes. I've never told anyone in person, only here, because to this day I can't understand what happened that night. Story 7. I've never been the type to get scared easily. I grew up hunting and fishing in northern Maine, so isolation and cold have always been part of my routine. Last winter, I decided to rent a small fishing hut on the shores of a frozen lake, to spend a few days alone and try to write a little. The owner gave me the keys at a local grocery store and warned me that the road was practically deserted after sunset. The idea was just that, total silence. The first night was quiet. The cabin was simple but cozy, a kitchen with a window facing the woods, a double bed, and a small fireplace. Outside, the wind made the snow accumulate on the steps of the balcony, and the sound of the burning firewood was the only noise. I slept early, satisfied with the isolation. On the second night, however, something took me out of the comfort of that loneliness. Around 10, I was washing a mug when I noticed something different on the kitchen window glass. They were hand marks. Two, well defined, pressed against the outside of the glass, as if someone had leaned there to spy. The marks were fresh, with the sharp drawing of the fingers and palm, and the snow was still falling outside. At first, I thought it was some illusion of light, perhaps a reflection of the fireplace, but when I got closer, I felt the cold of the surface and saw small drops of moisture dripping from the prints. That could only have been done a few minutes ago. My body locked for a moment. I looked out the window, but I only saw the darkness and the continuous whiteness of the snow. I turned off the lights and went to the room, trying to observe the outside through the curtain. The wind hit against the roof and made the sound confuse with footsteps in the snow. I waited in absolute silence, and after a few minutes I saw him. A silhouette, standing right in front of the kitchen window, motionless. The contour was human, broad shoulders, maybe a heavy coat, but the face was in the shade. I was watching, without breathing, trying to understand if it was someone or some reflection. But there was no reflection. The figure did not move, did not tremble, did not give any sign of being an illusion. It was as if someone was just there, standing still, looking inside my cabin. I tried not to make noise and reached the cell phone, but there was no network signal. That thing stayed there for several minutes. Sometimes I blinked and thought it was gone, but when my eyes got used to the darkness, I could still distinguish the contour. Finally, when the wind blowed stronger, the shape disappeared, as if it had moved away. I waited until dawn before leaving. The floor around the cabin was covered with footprints, dozens of them. They made complete turns around the cottage, as if the person had walked in circles for hours. The marks went to the forest and then suddenly disappeared in the middle of the high snow. But what bothered me the most was seeing the hands printed on the glass again, now covered by a thin layer of ice. I tried to rationalize. Maybe some lost hunter, someone who sought shelter or wanted to check if there were people there. Even so, the pattern of the footprints made me restless. Who would walk in circles for so long at that temperature? In the late afternoon, the snow came back hard. I spent the whole day inside the cabin, trying to ignore the discomfort and convince myself that everything was over. Around 9, I decided to sleep. The storm muffled any external sound, and for a moment, the constant noise of the snow hitting made me relax. Around midnight, a snap woke me up. It was the sound of something touching the glass. I stood completely still, listening attentively. The noise came again, a slight friction, like fingers sliding on the kitchen window. I went there without turning on the lights, and even with the pitch, I saw what seemed impossible. The handprints were there again, sharper than before. The snow fell heavily, and all the other marks around the cabin had already been covered. Only those two hands were there, perfectly defined, as if they had just been left. I left the cabin the next morning without looking back. I drove for miles until I reached the nearest city and left the key with the owner in the same market. He looked at me without saying anything, as if he already knew the reason. When I asked if anyone had ever commented on marks on the windows, he sighed and replied, "In winter, you're not the first." To this day, when I think of that night, I feel a cold different from the wind. The feeling that, outside that window, someone was watching me, and maybe I'm still there, waiting for the next cabin to turn on its lights. Story 8. I'm a freelance photographer, and last fall I rented an old cabin in New Hampshire to spend a few weeks alone. I wanted a quiet place to edit a project and photograph the landscapes before the snow. The house was from the 19th century, a renovated wooden structure, but still kept that old farm air. When I arrived, the owner explained to me that the attic was sealed. "Old thing," he said, and that the internal access was locked only for security. I didn't care. In the first few days, everything went well. The place was beautiful and quiet, surrounded by tall trees and a trail that led to a stream. At night, the wind beat the windows, and the clapping of the woods was the kind of sound you end up getting used to. But around the third night, I noticed something different. A light sound like slow steps coming from the ceiling. It wasn't a small animal. It looked like someone walking carefully, dragging something heavy on the ground. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving something up there. I tried to ignore it and went back to work, but the noise always came back at the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. It was a rhythmic sound, with long pauses, and sometimes it was accompanied by something like dragging furniture. The house had no lining, so you could clearly hear the weight of the footsteps echoing between the beams. I called the owner the next day and commented on the noises. He assured me that the attic had been closed for many years, that the access was sealed precisely because the structure was old and unsafe. He said there was no way someone would be there. The explanation seemed reasonable, but at night the sound came back, stronger, and this time next to him, a metallic snap, as if some lock had given way. I left the room with my heart racing and went to the hallway. The door that led to the attic was just above the stairs. When I pointed the flashlight of the cell phone, I realized that the small iron lock was fallen on the floor. I knew I had left it locked. The wood of the door was a little out of place, as if it had been forced from the inside out. I stood there for a few seconds, without the courage to touch. Everything was silent, and the only sound was the wind passing through the cracks. Finally, I decided to push the door slowly. She opened it with a loud creak, and the smell of mold and dust took over the corridor. The beam of light revealed a large room, with furniture covered by sheets and old boxes. It seemed that no one had entered there for decades. But the detail that left me breathless was a wooden ladder leaning against the wall, leading to the open skylight. The wind came in there, bringing wet leaves and a cold air that seemed new arrival. I kept looking at that, trying to understand if the wind could have opened by itself, but the skylight was stuck by a small internal lock, now broken. I went down the stairs shaking. I locked the front door, closed all the windows, and waited for dawn. When the sun rose, I called the city sheriff to check the place. He went up to the attic and stayed there for a few minutes. When he came down, he had a serious face. He said there were signs of recent use, blankets hidden behind a piece of furniture, food packages, and half-empty water bottles. Someone had lived there, probably going in and out through the roof at night. He explained to me that sometimes homeless people hide in out-of-season country houses, especially in cold regions. But what made me panic was knowing that someone could have been upstairs all those nights, while I slept alone downstairs. The sheriff found recent footprints near the roof, going down the side of the house to the woods. He said that maybe the person had heard the noise of the police car and fled before being seen. The skylight was sealed again, and the owner came the next day to pick up the keys. I tried to follow my routine after that, but I could never relax in isolated places again. Sometimes at night, I still wake up with the impression of hearing footsteps above me, the same light, dragged sound that made me open that door. And every time I remember the wind coming through the attic, I think that if I had gone up a few minutes earlier, maybe I would have found who was up there. You've made it to the end. Thank you for listening until now. But before we close, I have one last story for you. I rented that cabin in the middle of the Oregon forest because I needed to disconnect a little. I work with video editing. I spend whole days locked at home looking at the screen, and the idea of a weekend without notifications, without people, without noise seemed perfect. The cabin was in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a small stream passing nearby. The owner handed me the key, quickly explained how to turn on the heater, and commented that the attic was locked, used only to store old tools. I didn't even care. I just wanted to rest, cook something simple, and sleep without an alarm clock. The first night went the way I expected. I had a light dinner, left the fireplace lit, and read a book until sleep came. The sound of the wind in the trees was constant, and the snapping of the wood inside the cabin even seemed relaxing. I slept heavily, as I hadn't done in months. When I woke up, the sun was already crossing the curtains, and the air had that fresh smell of wet earth. That's when I realized something that shouldn't be there. The attic window was open. I only noticed because outside you could see the top of the cabin roof and that small, rectangular window at the top. She was wide open. I had never gone up there or moved the stairs that led upstairs. I was looking for a while, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the wind, but it was completely closed the night before. When I went to check, I realized there was something else. On the floor, right at the base of the stairs, there were small clay footprints. The kind of brand that is made with boots, not with shoes. They went from the carpet to the first step and disappeared there. That gave me an instant chill. The front door was locked, all the windows too. How could someone have entered? I tried to be rational. I thought that maybe the owner had come to check something before my arrival and forgot the open window. Even so, I cleaned the marks, closed the attic window, and decided not to think about it anymore. I went out for a walk in the forest, took some pictures of the stream, and came back at the end of the afternoon, already feeling calmer. But that night, while I was having dinner, I started to hear strange sounds. It was as if something lightly scratched the ceiling. Not an animal, but a rhythmic sound like slow steps on old wood. I stood still, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I turned up the radio volume, trying to ignore it. Around midnight, the noise came back. Now sharper. Heavy steps, one creak here, another there, as if someone walked from one side to the other right above the room where I was. I took the flashlight and stood still looking at the ceiling. I felt that cold in my stomach that we feel when the body perceives danger before the mind accepts it. I thought about going out, but it was completely dark outside. The forest at night is another world. The sound of the wind and the beating branches sounded like a chorus of voices. So I decided that if there was someone up there, I needed to know. I climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time. The noise stopped. When I got to the top, I pushed the attic door with my shoulder. The wood creaked loudly. The flashlight illuminated only what was ahead, and the rest was shadow. Everything seemed covered in dust, old boxes stacked, cobwebs, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw the window. She was open again. The cold wind came in hitting the torn curtain. And just below her, a wooden chair leaning against it, as if someone had used it to reach the window. At first I thought it was a coincidence, until I noticed the mark of a hand on the glass. A fresh mark, slightly blurred, on the outside. At that moment, I felt my stomach turn. The idea that someone could be outside, hanging on the attic window, watching while I slept, was the kind of thought that left me breathless. I stood there, unable to move for a few seconds, until a sound made me run down. A slight snack coming from the kitchen. I went down so fast that I almost slipped. The kitchen was empty, but the back door, the one I had locked, was ajar. An icy wind came through her. I closed it hard, locked it, and pushed a chair against the handle. I stayed up until dawn, sitting in the living room, with the flashlight in my hand. When the sun came out, I went up to the attic again. The window was now closed. The chair was still in the same place, but the hand mark was gone, as if someone had cleaned the glass. I went down, packed my bags, and decided to leave early. On the way back, I stopped at a gas station and told the attendant what happened, half laughing to disguise the fear. He looked serious and asked if I was staying at the old Dry Lake cabin. When I confirmed, he just said, "There were people who saw footprints going to the roof of that house last winter, but no one found anything." I never went back there. And the worst thing is that, weeks later, looking at the photos of the trip, I realized something that made me delete them all. In one of the images of the lake, taken on the first day, there is a shadow behind the attic window. A human silhouette, inclined, looking out. Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.